In the early hours of July 24th, 2026, residents of St. Petersburg woke to see Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer, burning. A column of thick black smoke climbing into the summer sky, visible across entire districts, filmed from apartment windows, and shared across Russian social media before the authorities had said a word. Air defense had been active overnight, explosions had been heard, and somewhere inside the city, a large industrial facility was on fire. Here is what makes this strike different from the ones that came before it. The target was not a naval base. It was not an oil terminal, a refinery, or a military airfield. The building on fire in St. Petersburg that morning, according to Russian Telegram media channels, was a warehouse, a logistics center belonging to an online shopping company. And if that sounds like a strange choice of target for a drone that has just flown more than 1,000 kilometers through some of the most heavily defended airspace in Russia, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you will understand why that burning warehouse may tell us more about the direction of this war than any strike on a military base this year. Start with the geography, because the geography is the first thing that should stop you. St. Petersburg sits roughly 1,100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. That is about 684 miles of Russian territory, radar coverage, and interceptor batteries between the launch point and the target. This is not just any Russian city, it is the city Vladimir Putin was born in, the city he built his political identity around, and one of the most densely protected pieces of airspace in the entire country. That protection is layered: S-400 batteries covering long-range approach corridors, Panzer S-1 systems handling closer threats, and radar networks designed to give interceptors time to respond. Throughout more than 4 years of full-scale war, St. Petersburg has been struck only rarely, precisely because the concentration of air defense around it made attacks costly and unreliable. When something burns inside that city, it means the protective bubble failed, again. And St. Petersburg was not alone that night. Overnight into July 24th, fires were reported at 3 separate facilities across 3 separate regions. One in St. Petersburg, one in the city of Tver, northwest of Moscow, where residents filmed thick smoke rising after a reported strike. And one in Simferopol, the largest city of occupied Crimea, where published footage appeared to capture the moment of impact at a warehouse complex that serves as a major logistics hub for the entire peninsula. 3 cities, 3 fires, 1 company. Every one of those facilities belongs to Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer. If you have never heard the name, the shortest useful description is this: Wildberries is Russia's answer to Amazon. It is the platform tens of millions of Russians use to order everything from clothing to electronics to household goods, moving those orders through a nationwide network of enormous fulfillment warehouses and sorting centers. When Poland placed the company under sanctions back in 2022, it described Wildberries as the largest taxpayer in the Russian Federation. Its founder, Tatiana Kim, is regularly described as the wealthiest woman in Russia, and she is under international sanctions herself. The European Union this week imposed additional sanctions on Wildberries' banking arm, a real-time signal of how Western governments are reading the company's role in the Russian economy. And in a sign of how the company's corporate footprint has evolved, its 2024 merger with Russ Outdoor, a major Russian advertising group, made Wildberries an even more embedded pillar of the Russian consumer landscape. So the question practically asks itself: why is Ukraine spending long-range drones, one of its most valuable and most contested resources, on the Russian equivalent of Amazon warehouses? To answer that, you need to see the full week, because the night of July 24th was not an isolated event. It was the 5th wave of strikes on this one company in 7 days, and the pattern across those 7 days is the story. It began on July 18th. That night, Ukrainian drones struck 2 Wildberries distribution centers, one in Elektrostal in the Moscow region, and one in Kotovsk in the Tambov region. Reporting from RBC Ukraine described these as the 2 largest warehouses in the company's network. Footage from Elektrostal showed residents walking past a wall of smoke where a fulfillment complex the size of several football pitches had been operating hours earlier. Then came the night of July 22nd. Drones reached 2 more logistics centers deep in southern Russia, one in Krasnodar and one in Nevinomysk in Stavropol Krai. This time, the human cost was visible immediately. Tatiana Kim said employees had been evacuated in advance, but confirmed that 15 people were injured across the 2 sites. The governor of Krasnodar Krai reported 10 people wounded at the facility in his region and later confirmed that a woman injured in the attack had died in hospital. Regional authorities declared a local state of emergency. More than 100 firefighters and a specialized helicopter were deployed to fight the blaze in Krasnodar, and the fires at both sites were large enough to be identified in satellite imagery. That same night, according to the company itself, 3 plants belonging to Miratorg, Russia's largest meat producer and one of the country's most strategically significant agribusiness conglomerates, were also targeted in the Bryansk region. The following night, July 23rd, it happened again. A Wildberries facility in Voronezh was reportedly struck, and the company announced that the warehouse would remain closed. Notably, Wildberries had already declared earlier that same day that its Voronezh warehouses would stop operating at night. Think about what that announcement actually is. Russia's largest retailer adjusting its national logistics schedule around the expectation of incoming drones. That is not a company reacting to a single unlucky event. That is a company adapting to a campaign. And then came the overnight strikes of July 24th, the ones we opened with. St. Petersburg, Tver, and Simferopol, all in a single night. The Kyiv Independent noted that it could not immediately verify the reports, and Ukraine's military had not commented on the attack at the time of writing, which is standard practice for strikes of this kind. Wildberries' own press service, however, confirmed that its warehouse in Simferopol had been hit. 5 waves, 7 days. At least 8 named facilities, 1 company. Now, a campaign this deliberate demands an explanation, and Ukraine has actually given one, publicly and repeatedly. After the July 18th strikes, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that these logistics centers are not civilian shopping infrastructure at all. In his telling, they are warehouses used to supply the Russian military, moving navigation equipment, components for drone production, and other supplies for the army through the same network that delivers consumer parcels. And after the strikes on Krasnodar and Stavropol, he went further, framing the entire effort in a single sentence, saying that we are justly returning the war to its source. The Kremlin, for its part, has denied that Wildberries handles military supplies. So you have a direct factual dispute between the two governments, and as always on this channel, we should be honest about what can and cannot be verified from open sources. What can be verified is this. Wildberries' own marketplace openly lists military-relevant equipment for sale, including drone components and body armor. Whether the company's warehouses function as a meaningful node in Russia's military supply chain is a harder question. And it is exactly the kind of question that Ukrainian targeting officers, with access to intelligence we do not have, appear to believe they have answered. But set the military supply argument aside for a moment, because even in the most conservative reading, the economic dimension of this campaign is doing enormous work on its own. And the numbers, even the cautious ones, are striking. The Russian edition of Forbes cited preliminary estimates suggesting Wildberries may have lost up to 9% of its total warehouse space in these strikes, with restoration costs reaching as much as 33 billion rubles, roughly $421 million. Open source analysts have gone higher, estimating that between 8 and more than 14% of the company's logistics infrastructure has been damaged, somewhere between 444,000 and 802,000 square meters of floor space. And media analysts cited in Ukrainian reporting have placed total damages at 100 billion rubles or more, approximately $1.2 billion. Those figures span a wide range, they come from different methodologies, and none of them are official. Treat them accordingly. But notice that even the lowest estimate describes a level of destruction that no retailer on Earth could shrug off, inflicted in a single week by drones that each cost a small fraction of the buildings they burned. For context, companies like Ozone, Wildberries' main domestic competitor, are now watching their own logistics exposure with obvious anxiety, and Sberbank, one of the payment processors deeply embedded in Russia's e-commerce infrastructure, has its own reasons to watch how this unfolds. And the second-order effects are already rippling outward in ways that are harder to measure, but arguably more important. Wildberries does not just store its own goods. Hundreds of thousands of small Russian sellers stock their inventory inside those warehouses. When Krasnodar and Nevinomisk burned, so did their stock. One video that circulated widely on Ukrainian social media featured a Russian seller whose goods were sitting in those warehouses, saying openly that he simply wanted the special military operation to end. And in a detail that says a great deal about where this is heading, several Russian sellers complained that Wildberries had recently changed its terms of service to state that the company bears no liability for damage caused by drone attacks. Russia's largest retailer has, in writing, made enemy drone strikes a standard commercial risk of doing business inside Russia. Sit with that for a moment, because this is where the campaign against a shopping company connects to everything else we have covered on this channel. For most of the past year, the centerpiece of Ukraine's long-range campaign has been energy, refineries, export terminals, pumping stations, oil depots. Regular viewers will remember what that campaign did. Fuel rationing spreading across dozens of Russian regions, queues at petrol stations far from any front line, export volumes collapsing, and on one memorable morning in June, an oil terminal burning 17 kilometers from Putin's flagship economic forum in this very same city of St. Petersburg. That campaign targeted the revenue that funds the Russian state. The July 2026 Wildberries drone campaign marks a deliberate shift in target category, and understanding that shift is key to reading where Ukraine's long-range strategy is heading. What changed in mid-July is the target category. Logistics hubs for consumer commerce sit one step closer to ordinary Russian life than a refinery does. A fuel queue is an inconvenience millions of Russians have now learned to live with. But the app on your phone telling you that your parcel has been delayed because the warehouse holding it no longer exists, that reaches a different part of the population in a different way. It reaches people in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan who have spent 4 years being assured that the war is a distant, controlled operation happening somewhere else. The strikes on Wildberries take the single most familiar piece of modern Russian consumer infrastructure and turn it into evidence that the distance has collapsed. That is the answer to the question posed at the start of this video. Why spend precious long-range drones on warehouses full of parcels? Because in the calculus this campaign appears to follow, those warehouses are 3 targets in one. They are, in Kyiv's stated assessment, military supply nodes. They are billion-dollar economic assets belonging to a sanctioned company described as the Russian state's largest taxpayer. And they are the most visible possible demonstration to tens of millions of Russian consumers that nowhere inside the country is out of reach. Which brings us back to St. Petersburg, because the location of that final strike is not incidental, and the defense picture behind it deserves a closer look. The concentration of air defense around St. Petersburg exists for obvious reasons. The city is a political symbol, a naval headquarters, a major port, and the president's hometown. For most of this war, that protective ring, built around long-range S-400 systems and close-in Panzer S-1 batteries, largely held, and the city's residents experienced the conflict mainly through news broadcasts. That began to change over the past year as Ukrainian drone development pushed range, speed, and coordination to levels that allow large simultaneous raids to saturate even dense defensive networks. Ukraine's domestically produced long-range drones, including variants like the Beaver and Bober UAVs, developed from lessons learned watching platforms like the Bayraktar TB2 early in the war, have evolved into tools capable of reaching targets that were once considered safely beyond reach. Kyiv Independent reporting this week noted directly that recent Ukrainian drone advancements have been penetrating the defenses of heavily fortified cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, with growing regularity. The night before the Wildberries strikes in the north, Russia's defense ministry claimed its forces had intercepted 223 Ukrainian drones across 19 regions in a single night. Even taking that claim entirely at face value, the fires that keep appearing on Russian social media each morning tell you what matters. Enough drones are getting through, night after night, to sustain a systematic campaign against targets of Ukraine's choosing, more than 1,000 kilometers from the border. For a militarily literate audience, the implication is worth stating plainly. AIR defense is a mathematics problem, and Russia is on the wrong side of the equation. Every interceptor missile defending a city like St. Petersburg costs vastly more than the drone it is fired at. Every S-400 battery repositioned to protect warehouses and terminals in the northwest is a battery not protecting a refinery on the Volga, an airfield near the front, or an oil depot in the south. Ukraine's campaign forces Russia to defend everything, everywhere, indefinitely, against attacks that cost the attacker comparatively little. No air defense architecture in existence, Russian or Western, is built to win that exchange forever. That lesson is being studied very carefully in every NATO capital, because the problem Ukraine has posed to Russian air defense this month is the same problem any future adversary could pose to European air defense, and it is reshaping procurement debates about interceptor drones, gun-based defenses, and directed energy across the alliance. Now, the honest caveats, because this channel does not deal in certainty it has not earned. The July 24th strikes were, at the time of recording, reported by Russian Telegram channels and confirmed only partially by Wildberries itself, with no comment from Ukraine's military. The damage estimates vary by a factor of 3 depending on the source. Russia's economy has absorbed heavier blows than the loss of warehouse capacity and continued functioning, and nothing about burning fulfillment centers, by itself, ends a war. Ukraine is absorbing severe strikes on its own cities, including a bomb attack on Zaporizhia the very same evening that injured at least 25 people. Anyone presenting this campaign as decisive is ahead of the evidence, and you should treat them accordingly. But the trajectory is not seriously in dispute. The events of this single week form a sequence. 2 of the largest warehouses in Russia burned on the 18th, 2 more in the south on the 22nd with a state of emergency declared, Voronezh on the 23rd with night operations abandoned, and then on the 24th, simultaneous fires in occupied Crimea, in Tver, and in the most protected city in Russia. Each wave arrived despite everything Russian air defense could put in its way, and each wave landed on infrastructure that touches ordinary Russian life more directly than the last. This campaign is still unfolding. The next wave, the official damage figures, and Moscow's response, whether that is a redeployment of air defense, retaliation, or something else entirely, will shape where this goes next, and when it does, the analysis will be here. If this is the kind of coverage you want as events develop, now is a very good time to subscribe, because this story is moving fast. So let us end where the title began. Ukrainian drones struck Putin's hometown, and then this happened. Nothing that Russia's government could point to as a victory, and everything that its official version of the war cannot accommodate. The fires were put out. The videos stayed up. Wildberries told millions of waiting customers to be patient, and somewhere in the planning cells that have spent 7 days working through one company's warehouse network, the next target list was already being drawn up. For 4 years, the unspoken promise of the Russian home front was that the war would stay on the other side of the border, and for 4 years, distance did most of the work of keeping that promise. What burned in St. Petersburg on the morning of July 24th was a warehouse. What it took with it was the last comfortable assumption that anywhere in Russia, even the president's own city, even the app on an ordinary citizen's phone, sits safely beyond the reach of the war Moscow started.